The hooksome secrets are buried so deep that even the earth refuses to keep them hidden. When 17-year-old Maya Johnson stepped into that pristine white church on what should have been the happiest day of someone else's life, she carried with her a truth that would shatter more than just wedding bells. Her dark skin glistened with nervous sweat. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor, and clutched in her trembling hand was a crumpled photograph that held the power to destroy a family's carefully constructed lies. She hadn't come for revenge. She hadn't come for money. She had come for something far simpler and infinitely more precious. The chance to look into the eyes of the man whose DNA ran through her veins, the man who had been hidden from her for 17 long years. But sometimes the simplest desires unleash the most devastating consequences. As 200 guests turned to stare at the unexpected visitor, and as the bride's perfect smile began to crack like fine china, Maya realized that some truths are too powerful to whisper. Some truths demand to be shouted from church altars, even if they bring the whole sanctuary crashing down. This is the story of a girl who only wanted to see her father's face, and how that single, innocent wish changed everything for everyone in that room. This is the story of how love, lies, and blood ties can create a storm so fierce that not even the most perfect wedding day can survive its fury. Maya Johnson had always wondered what it felt like to have a father who stayed. Not the kind who sent birthday cards 3 months late or showed up drunk to school plays, but the kind who helped with homework and knew how to fix broken bicycles and remembered to ask about math tests. The kind of father her friends complained about, but secretly treasured. She stood outside St. Michael's Cathedral on that bright Saturday morning in June, watching families arrive in their finest clothes. The men wore dark suits and carried themselves with the confidence that comes from never having to wonder where they belonged. The women glided across the parking lot in heels that cost more than Maya's mother earned in a week at the diner. Children ran between the cars, their laughter echoing off the stone walls of the church, secure in the knowledge that someone would catch them if they fell. Maya looked down at her own reflection in the church's glass doors. She wore the best dress she owned, a navy blue number she had found at the thrift store, and altered herself. Her mother, Patricia, had taught her to sew when she was 8 years old, back when they still believed that hard work and good intentions could fix anything. The dress fit well enough, but it could not hide what Maya had always known about herself. She did not belong in places like this. The photograph in her hand had become soft with handling over the years. She had found it tucked inside one of her mother's old books when she was 14, a candid shot of a man with kind eyes and Maya's exact smile. On the back, written in her mother's careful handwriting, were the words, David, Maya's father, 1999. Below that, someone had written an address that Maya had memorized long before she worked up the courage to use it. For 3 years, Maya had carried that address like a secret prayer. She had walked past the house it led to 17 times, always on the opposite side of the street, always with her hood pulled up and her head down. The house was everything she had imagined, and nothing she could ever have. White columns, manicured lawn, 3-car garage, and always, the sense that the people inside lived lives untouched by the kind of struggles that kept Maya awake at night. She had never seen him, though. The man in the photograph had remained as elusive as morning mist. Cars came and went from the driveway, but Maya never caught a glimpse of the face that might mirror her own. Until last Tuesday, when her friend Jessica had shown her the wedding announcement in the Sunday paper. Look at this, Jessica had said, spreading the social pages across their lunch table. The Hawthorne wedding is going to be huge. My mom's catering company got rejected for the job because they said it wasn't fancy enough. Maya had glanced at the page without much interest until she saw the photograph. There he was, older now, graying at the temples, but unmistakably the same man whose picture she carried. David Hawthorne, successful businessman and pillar of the community, walking his daughter down the aisle at what the paper called the social event of the season. The world had tilted sideways for Maya in that moment. She read the article 3 times, memorizing every detail. The bride was 22, a college graduate with plans for law school. The groom came from old money and worked in his family's investment firm. The reception would be held at the country club, where memberships cost more than most people's houses. And David Hawthorne, Maya's father, would be there to give away the daughter he had raised, loved, and claimed. The daughter who got to carry his name, and live in his house, and never wonder where she came from. Maya had spent the weeks since that discovery in a strange state of suspended animation. She went to her job at the grocery store, attended her high school classes, helped her mother pay bills at the kitchen table that wobbled on its broken leg. But underneath it all, a plan was forming. Not a plan for revenge or confrontation, but something simpler and more desperate. She just wanted to see him, to stand in the same room, and look at the face that had given her her own features. To know, for just one moment, what it felt like to be in the presence of the man whose absence had shaped her entire life. The church bells began to toll, their deep bronze voices calling the congregation to witness a sacred bond. Maya watched the last stragglers hurry through the doors, their faces bright with anticipation for the celebration to come. She knew she did not have an invitation. She knew her presence would raise questions she was not prepared to answer. But she also knew that if she walked away now, she might never have another chance. Inside the church, the organ began to play. Maya could hear the rustle of fabric as 200 guests rose to their feet, the gentle murmur of voices as people prepared to witness love triumph over all obstacles. The irony was not lost on her. She was about to enter a celebration of family unity while carrying the proof that families were built on foundations far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Maya climbed the stone steps slowly, her sneakers silent against the worn granite. The heavy wooden doors stood open, and she could see the interior of the church bathed in colored light from stained glass windows. Flowers decorated every surface, their perfume drifting out to meet her like a benediction or a warning. At the threshold, Maya paused. Once she stepped inside, there would be no taking it back. Whatever happened next would happen because she had chosen to walk into a moment that was never meant for her. She thought about her mother, who was working a double shift at the diner and had no idea what her daughter was planning. Patricia had never spoken David Hawthorne's name aloud, had never explained why Maya had grown up with questions instead of answers. Maybe this was why. Maybe some truths were too dangerous to be spoken. But Maya was 17 years old, and 17-year-olds believe in the power of truth to set things right. She stepped across the threshold and into the church. The interior was even more beautiful than she had imagined. Sunlight streamed through windows that depicted scenes from the Bible in jeweled tones of ruby and sapphire and gold. The pews were filled with well-dressed guests, their faces turned toward the altar where the groom waited with nervous excitement. Flowers cascaded from every available surface, creating an atmosphere of abundance that Maya had never experienced. She slipped into the last pew, keeping her head down and trying to make herself invisible. From her position at the back of the church, she had a clear view of the altar and the processional aisle. In just a few minutes, David Hawthorne would walk down that aisle with his daughter, the daughter he had chosen to keep and love and raise. The organ music swelled, and the congregation rustled with expectation. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as the wedding party began their procession. First came the bridesmaids in their pale pink dresses, walking slowly and gracefully down the aisle. Then, the maid of honor, carrying a bouquet that probably cost more than Maya's mother made in a month. And then, the music changed, shifting to the traditional wedding march that every little girl dreams of hearing on her special day. The congregation rose as one, turning to face the back of the church where the bride would make her entrance. Maya rose with them, her legs trembling as she prepared to see the man whose face had haunted her dreams and shaped her imagination for as long as she could remember. The bride appeared in the doorway, radiant in white silk and ancestral lace. She was beautiful in the way that privilege allows, with perfect teeth and flawless skin and confidence that came from never having to doubt her place in the world. But Maya barely saw her. All her attention was focused on the man beside her. David Hawthorne was exactly as Maya had imagined, and completely different from her dreams. He was taller than she had expected, with gray threading through hair that had once been the same dark brown as her own. His face was kind but tired, marked by the passage of years and the weight of responsibilities Maya could only guess at. He wore his tuxedo with the ease of a man who belonged in formal clothes, who attended events like this as a matter of course rather than as a once-in-a-lifetime intrusion. But it was his eyes that stopped Maya's breath in her chest. They were her eyes, the same unusual shade of green that she had inherited from him. The same eyes that looked back at her from mirrors and photographs, the feature that made people comment that she looked like nobody else in her family. As father and daughter made their slow procession down the aisle, Maya felt something break open inside her chest. This was her father. This was the man whose absence had created a hole in her life that she had tried to fill with good grades and part-time jobs, and the fierce independence that her mother praised but sometimes seemed to fear. This was the man who had given her life and then walked away from it, leaving her to grow up with questions instead of bedtime stories. David and his daughter reached the altar, and Maya watched as he performed the traditional ritual of placing his daughter's hand in her groom's. The gesture was symbolic and ancient, the passing of responsibility from one man to another, the acknowledgement that a woman belonged first to her father and then to her husband. Maya, who had never belonged to anyone but herself and her tired mother, watched this ceremony of ownership and felt something hot and bitter rise in her throat. The bride's veil fluttered as she turned to kiss her father's cheek, and David stepped back to take his place in the front pew beside a woman who must have been his wife. Maya studied the woman's face, searching for clues about the life her father had built after walking away from her. The woman was elegant in the way that money and education could create, with silver hair styled perfectly and jewelry that caught the light from the stained glass windows. Maya wondered if this woman knew about her. Did David Hawthorne lie awake at night sometimes, thinking about the daughter he had abandoned? Did his wife know that somewhere across town, a girl with his eyes was stocking grocery store shelves and wondering what it would be like to have a father who stayed? The minister began the ceremony, his voice carrying easily through the vast space of the church. Maya tried to focus on the words, on the familiar ritual of marriage that she was witnessing, but her attention kept drifting to the back of David's head. She was close enough now to see the individual gray hairs at his temple, close enough to notice that his shoulders slumped slightly, as if he carried burdens he could not set down. During the exchange of vows, Maya found herself studying the bride with new interest. This was her half-sister, a stranger who shared her blood, but had lived a completely different life. The bride spoke her vows in a clear, confident voice, promising love and faithfulness to the man beside her. She was everything Maya was not: polished, educated, secure in her place in the world. She had grown up with David Hawthorne's love and protection, had never wondered if she was worthy of belonging somewhere. Maya felt tears begin to prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She had not come here to feel sorry for herself. She had come to see her father, and she had accomplished that goal. In a few minutes, the ceremony would end, and the congregation would move to the reception. Maya would slip out the back door and return to her own life, carrying with her the memory of finally seeing the man whose absence had defined her childhood. But as the minister asked if anyone present knew of any reason why this couple should not be wed, Maya felt something shift inside her chest. The question was traditional, ceremonial, expected to pass without response. But Maya found herself thinking about truth and lies, about the children who grow up not knowing where they come from, about the fathers who walk away, and the mothers who work double shifts to fill the gaps left behind. Before she quite realized what she was doing, Maya stood up. The movement was small, barely noticeable in a congregation of 200 people. But something about the way she rose, the way she stood perfectly still in the back pew with her hands clenched at her sides, drew attention. A few people in the pews near her turned to look, and then a few more. Maya felt the weight of their stares and realized that she had crossed some invisible line. She was no longer an anonymous observer in the back of the church. She was a disruption, a question mark in a ceremony designed to celebrate certainty. At the altar, the minister waited for the traditional silence that would allow him to continue. But the silence stretched longer than it should have, becoming heavy with tension as more and more people turned to see what had caught their neighbors' attention. Maya's legs felt like water beneath her, but she remained standing. She had spent her entire life making herself invisible, stepping aside to let other people claim their space, accepting that she was the kind of person who watched life happen rather than participated in it. But, standing in that church, looking at the back of her father's head while his chosen daughter promised herself to another man, Maya felt 17 years of silence press against her throat like a scream demanding to be released. The bride had turned slightly, trying to see what was causing the disturbance. The groom shifted nervously, his smile becoming strained as he sensed that something was wrong. At the front of the church, David Hawthorne sat perfectly still, unaware that his past had walked into his present and was standing 20 feet behind him. Maya opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. What could she say? What words could possibly bridge the gap between who she was and who she wanted to be? How could she explain that she had come not to destroy his daughter's wedding but simply to exist in the same space as the man who had given her life and then forgotten about her? But the congregation was stirring now, whispers beginning to ripple through the pews like wind through tall grass. The minister looked puzzled, his eyes searching the church for the source of the disturbance. Maya realized that she had already disrupted the ceremony simply by standing, simply by being present in a space where she did not belong. She thought about leaving. She could sit back down, slip out the back door, and pretend this had never happened. She could return to her small life and let the Hawthorne family continue their celebration without ever knowing that she existed. But as she prepared to sit down, to disappear back into the anonymity that had protected her all her life, David Hawthorne turned around. Perhaps he had felt the weight of the congregation's attention shifting. Perhaps some instinct had told him that something significant was happening behind him. Whatever the reason, he turned in his pew to see what had disrupted his daughter's wedding. For a moment that lasted forever, Maya looked directly into her father's eyes. The same green eyes she saw in her own reflection, the eyes that had always marked her as different in a family of brown-eyed women. David's face went completely blank, as if his mind was struggling to process what he was seeing. Maya watched recognition dawn across his features like sunrise over a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. She saw the moment when he understood who she was, when the reality of her existence crashed into the carefully constructed world he had built since walking away from her mother 17 years ago. The church had gone completely silent now. 200 guests sat frozen in their pews, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The bride stood at the altar in her white dress, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she tried to understand why her father was staring at a strange girl in the back of the church. Maya felt the photograph in her hand, the image of David that she had carried like a talisman for 3 years. She thought about all the times she had imagined this moment, all the conversations she had practiced in her mirror late at night. None of her rehearsals had prepared her for the reality of seeing her father's face change from confusion to recognition to something that looked like terror. She tried to speak, to say the words she had come here to say. But, the first person to break the silence was the bride herself. Catherine Hawthorne, beautiful in her ivory silk and grandmother's pearls, turned fully around to see what had stolen her father's attention on what was supposed to be the most important day of her life. When she saw Maya standing in the back pew, when she noticed the way her father's face had gone completely white, something cold settled in her stomach. "Daddy," Catherine's voice carried clearly through the church, amplified by the excellent acoustics that had been designed to carry prayers to heaven. "Daddy, what's wrong?" David Hawthorne seemed to shake himself awake from a dream. He turned back toward the altar, but his movements were mechanical, as if someone else was operating his body by remote control. Maya could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the pew until his knuckles went white. The minister, Reverend Williams, had officiated hundreds of weddings in his 30-year career. He had seen nervous grooms faint at the altar, had watched drunk relatives make inappropriate toasts, had even once had to stop a ceremony when the bride's ex-boyfriend burst through the doors declaring his undying love. But he had never seen anything quite like this. The charged atmosphere in the church felt like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the very air seemed to vibrate with potential energy. "Perhaps we should continue," Reverend Williams said gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades guiding people through life's most significant moments. "Catherine and James have come here today to join their lives together in holy matrimony. But Catherine was no longer looking at her groom. She was staring at her father, and then at the girl in the back of the church, and then back at her father again. Catherine had always been intelligent, the kind of child who noticed things that adults thought they had hidden. She had grown up with the vague sense that there were rooms in her father's heart that she was not allowed to enter, conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, a sadness in his eyes that no amount of love from his family seemed to heal. "Who is that girl?" Catherine asked, and her voice was no longer the confident tone of a bride ready to begin her new life. It was the voice of a daughter who was beginning to suspect that everything she thought she knew about her family might be wrong. Maya felt the weight of 200 stairs pressing against her like physical force. She had imagined this moment so many times, but she had never considered that it would happen in front of an audience. In her fantasies, she had always pictured a private moment, perhaps approaching David after church or finding him at his office. She had never imagined that her first conversation with her father would take place in front of his wife, his daughter, his friends, his business associates, and half the social elite of their city. The bride's mother, Eleanor Hawthorne, had been watching the exchange with growing alarm. She was a woman who had built her life around maintaining appearances, who understood instinctively that whatever was happening threatened everything she had worked to create. She rose from her seat in the front pew and turned to face the congregation. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of running charity committees and social events. "Perhaps we could ask our unexpected guest to wait outside while we complete the ceremony." But Maya found her voice at last. It came out smaller than she had intended, barely more than a whisper, but in the perfect silence of the church, everyone heard her clearly. "I only wanted to see my father's face." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Maya felt them leave her lips and knew that she could never take them back, could never pretend that she had not spoken the truth that had been burning inside her for 17 years. Catherine's bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the marble floor with a sound like breaking glass. The white roses scattered across the steps of the altar, their perfect petals bruised by the impact. No one moved to pick them up. "Your father?" Catherine's voice was barely audible now, and Maya could see understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. "Your father?" David Hawthorne stood up slowly, like an old man despite being only 45 years old. When he turned to face Maya this time, she could see that his face had changed completely. The confusion was gone, replaced by something that looked like resignation mixed with panic. "How did you find me?" His voice carried across the church, and Maya realized that this was the first time she had ever heard her father speak. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, with a slight rasp that suggested he had spent years holding back words he wanted to say. The simple question confirmed what everyone in the church was beginning to understand. This was not a case of mistaken identity or a confused teenager who had wandered into the wrong ceremony. This was David Hawthorne's daughter, a daughter that most of the people in the church had never known existed. Maya lifted her hand, showing the photograph that she had carried like a prayer for 3 years. Even from the distance between them, David recognized it immediately. She watched his face crumple slightly, as if he was remembering the moment when that picture was taken, remembering the woman who had saved it all these years. "My mother kept your picture," Maya said, and her voice was stronger now, fed by 17 years of questions that finally had someone to hear them. "She kept it in her copy of Jane Eyre. I found it when I was 14. Eleanor Hawthorne sank back into her pew as if her legs could no longer support her. She had always known, Maya realized. Perhaps not the details, perhaps not the name of the girl or the exact circumstances, but she had known that somewhere in her husband's past there was a woman and a child that he had chosen to leave behind. "Patricia," David said, and the name fell from his lips like a stone into still water. "How is Patricia?" Maya felt tears start to burn at the corners of her eyes. Her mother's name in her father's mouth sounded strange and precious, like hearing a foreign language that she almost but not quite understood. "She works at Murphy's Diner," Maya said. "Double shifts most days. She never talks about you. She never even said your name until I found the picture and asked her about it." The details were small and ordinary, but they hit David like physical blows. Maya could see him imagining her mother in a diner uniform, serving coffee to strangers, working twice as hard as she should have to because she was raising a child alone. She could see him calculating the years, adding up all the birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that he had missed. Catherine was crying now, tears streaming down her face, and ruining the makeup that had taken 2 hours to perfect. Her groom, James, stood beside her looking lost and confused, as if he had walked into the wrong movie and could not find his way back to the romantic comedy he thought he had signed up for. "I don't understand," Catherine said, and her voice broke on the words. "Daddy, I don't understand what's happening." Maya looked at her half-sister, this beautiful girl in white who had lived the life that Maya had always imagined. Catherine had grown up with bedtime stories and birthday parties and a father who helped with homework and attended school plays. She had never wondered if she was worthy of love, never questioned whether she belonged in her own family. "I'm your sister," Maya said gently, and the words felt strange in her mouth. She had never said them aloud before, had never had anyone to say them to. "I'm 17. I'm your half-sister." The congregation erupted in whispers then, the kind of hushed conversation that happens when people witness something they know they will talk about for the rest of their lives. Maya could hear fragments of conversation floating through the air like confetti. "Did you know? And how is this possible? And that poor girl." But Maya was no longer paying attention to the crowd. She was focused entirely on David, on the father who had been absent from her life for so long that she had built him up in her imagination until he was more myth than man. Looking at him now, she could see that he was not the villain she had sometimes imagined, but he was not the hero either. He was just a man who had made choices and lived with the consequences, and who was now facing a consequence he had never expected. Why? The question came out of Maya's mouth before she could stop it. It was the question that had lived at the center of her heart for as long as she could remember, the question that had shaped every other question she had ever asked about herself. "Why did you leave us?" David's face went through a series of expressions so quickly that Maya could barely track them. Pain, guilt, fear, regret, and something that might have been love all flickered across his features like shadows cast by a fire. "Maya," he said, and hearing her name in his voice was like hearing a song she had only dreamed of. "Maya." But before he could finish the sentence, Eleanor Hawthorne stood up again. This time, her voice carried the kind of steel that Maya recognized from her mother's voice when Patricia was pushed too far. "This is neither the time nor the place for this conversation," Eleanor said coldly. "Catherine's wedding day will not be ruined by ancient history." Ancient history? Maya felt the words like a slap across her face. Her entire life, her mother's sacrifices, her own questions and longing and years of wondering, all of it dismissed as ancient history by the woman who had been allowed to keep David while Maya and her mother were erased from his story. Ancient history? Maya's voice was louder now, fed by an anger that had been building for years without her fully realizing it. "I'm not ancient history. I'm your husband's daughter. I exist. I'm real." The confrontation was escalating beyond what anyone in the church could have anticipated. Reverend Williams stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Perhaps we could all take a moment to breathe," he suggested. "This is clearly a family matter that requires privacy and careful consideration." But Catherine was still staring at Maya, and something in her expression was shifting from shock to curiosity. Despite the circumstances, despite the timing, she was looking at Maya the way someone might study their own reflection in a funhouse mirror, searching for familiar features in an unexpected place. "You have his eyes," Catherine said suddenly. "You have Daddy's eyes." The observation hung in the air like a bridge being built between them. Maya nodded, touching her face unconsciously. She had always known that her green eyes were unusual in her family, had always wondered where they had come from. Now she knew. "I've wondered about them my whole life," Maya admitted. "My mother's eyes are brown. My grandmother's were brown. I always felt like I was looking at the world through someone else's eyes." David made a sound that might have been a sob. He sat down heavily in the pew, his head in his hands. Maya realized that this was as difficult for him as it was for her, perhaps more so. She had come here by choice, with some idea of what she wanted to happen. He had been ambushed by his past on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. "David," Eleanor said, and Her voice was sharp with warning. "We need to handle this properly. Privately." But Maya could see that the moment for privacy had passed. 200 witnesses had heard her claim David as her father, had seen him recognize her, had watched this family's secrets spill out across the altar like wine across white linen. There would be no putting this back in the bottle, no pretending it had never happened. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," Maya said. And she was speaking to all of them now. David, Eleanor, Catherine, even the groom who was still standing at the altar looking like he wished he could disappear. "I just wanted to see him. I just wanted to know what he looked like, what his voice sounded like. I wanted to know where I came from." The simple honesty in her voice seemed to defuse some of the tension in the church. Maya was not demanding money or attention or a place in their family. She was just a girl who had grown up with questions, seeking answers in the only way she knew how. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara, but not seeming to care. She looked at her father, then at Maya, then back at her father again. "Is it true?" she asked David. "Is she really my sister?" David lifted his head from his hands and looked at his daughter, the daughter he had raised and loved and been present for every day of her life. Maya could see the war playing out across his face, the battle between the truth and the life he had built on top of that truth. "Yes," he said finally, and the word came out like a confession. "Yes, she's your sister." The admission seemed to take the last of his strength. David slumped in the pew like a man who had been carrying a heavy load for too long and had finally set it down. Maya felt something release in her chest, a knot of tension that she had been carrying since childhood finally, beginning to unravel. She had wanted to hear him say it, had needed to hear him acknowledge that she existed, that she was his daughter, that the connection she felt was real, and not just the fantasy of a girl who had grown up without a father. Now he had said it, and the words could never be taken back. But as Maya stood there in the aftermath of her father's admission, she began to realize that getting the answer she had wanted was only the beginning. Now she had to figure out what came next, how to exist in a world where her secret was no longer secret, where her father's family knew about her existence. The church was still silent except for the sound of Catherine crying and the whisper of fabric as guests shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Maya looked at the scene she had created, a bride in tears, a groom in shock, a congregation turned into unwilling witnesses to a family drama they had never asked to see. For the first time since walking into the church, Maya began to understand what her mother had been protecting her from all these years. Patricia had not kept David's identity secret to hurt Maya. She had kept it secret to prevent exactly this kind of scene, this kind of pain that radiated outward from the truth to touch everyone in its path. Maya thought about leaving then, about slipping out the back door and returning to her normal life. She had accomplished what she had come for. She had seen her father's face, had heard him acknowledge her existence. Maybe that should be enough. But as she prepared to turn and go, Catherine spoke again. "Wait," she said, and her voice was stronger now, less shaky. "Please wait. I want to talk to you." Maya looked at her half-sister, this girl who had everything Maya had ever wanted and who was now learning that her perfect life was built on a foundation of secrets. Catherine was still beautiful despite her tears, still radiant despite the circumstances, but she looked older now, as if she had aged years in the space of minutes. "I want to know about you," Catherine continued. "I want to know about our father. I want to know why I never knew I had a sister." The request hung in the air between them, an invitation and a challenge all at once. Maya realized that Catherine was offering her something she had never expected: recognition, acceptance, the possibility of a relationship with the sister she had never known existed. But acceptance would mean staying, would mean facing all the questions and complications that her presence had created. It would mean dealing with Eleanor's anger and David's guilt and the disruption of a family that had been built around her absence. Maya looked once more at her father, at the man whose face she had wanted to see for so long. He was looking back at her now, and in his eyes she could see 17 years of regret and something that might have been love. The silence in St. Michael's Cathedral had become unbearable, pressing down on the congregation like the weight of accumulated years. Maya could feel 200 pairs of eyes studying her. cataloging every detail of her appearance, comparing her features to David's, searching for the family resemblance that would confirm or deny what they had just witnessed. James Richardson, Catherine's groom, finally found his voice. He had been standing at the altar in his perfectly pressed tuxedo for what felt like hours, watching his wedding day transform into something he could never have imagined. His family had flown in from Boston for this ceremony. His grandmother had worn the same pearls she had worn to her own wedding 60 years ago. This was supposed to be a celebration of love conquering all obstacles, not a revelation about secret children and abandoned families. "Catherine," James said gently, reaching for his bride's hand. "Maybe we should postpone the ceremony. Give everyone time to process what's happening." But Catherine pulled her hand away from his, her attention still focused entirely on Maya. There was something fierce in her expression now, something that reminded Maya of her own determination to find answers no matter what the cost. "No," Catherine said firmly. "I've waited 22 years to find out I had a sister. I'm not waiting any longer." Eleanor Hawthorne stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She had built her social standing carefully over 25 years of marriage to David, hosting the right parties, supporting the right charities, ensuring that the Hawthorne name was associated with respectability and success. In the space of 10 minutes, a teenager in a thrift store dress had threatened to destroy everything Eleanor had worked to create. "This is absurd," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "We are not going to turn my daughter's wedding into a circus for the entertainment of our guests. Whatever issues need to be resolved can be handled privately at a more appropriate time." Maya felt the sting of Eleanor's words, but she also felt something else, a growing certainty that she belonged in this conversation, that her 17 years of questions gave her the right to demand answers. She was no longer the invisible girl who watched life happen to other people. She was David Hawthorne's daughter, and that meant something, even if nobody wanted to acknowledge it. "When would be a more appropriate time?" Maya asked, and her voice was stronger now, fed by the adrenaline of finally speaking truth after years of silence. "When would it be convenient for you to acknowledge that your husband has another daughter?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Maya could see the older woman's careful composure beginning to crack, revealing the fear and anger that lay beneath her polished exterior. David finally spoke again, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Eleanor, please. This isn't Maya's fault. If anyone should be blamed for this situation, it should be me." But Eleanor turned on her husband with fury that had clearly been building for years. "How could you do this to us, David? How could you let her show up here, today of all days, and destroy everything we've built?" The admission was more revealing than Eleanor probably intended. Maya realized that David's wife had known about her existence, had always known, and had spent years living with the knowledge that somewhere her husband had another family he had abandoned. The secret had been poisoning their marriage slowly, creating a foundation of lies that was finally cracking under pressure. Maya looked at her father and saw him truly for the first time, not as the mythical figure she had built up in her imagination, but as a flawed man who had made choices he regretted and built a life on top of those choices. She could see the guilt written across his features, the weight of 17 years of wondering about the daughter he had left behind. "I didn't know she would come here," David said quietly. "I never imagined she would find me." The words stung Maya more than she had expected. In all her fantasies about meeting her father, she had never considered that he might not want to be found, that her presence in his life might be unwelcome rather than the joyful reunion she had imagined. Catherine was still staring at Maya, and now she stepped down from the altar, her wedding dress rustling against the marble steps. The movement sent whispers through the congregation, but Catherine seemed oblivious to the attention. She walked slowly down the aisle until she was standing just a few feet away from Maya. Up close, the family resemblance was even more obvious. Both girls had David's green eyes, though Catherine's were framed by lashes darkened with expensive mascara while Maya's were bare. Both had inherited his stubborn chin and the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking. But where Catherine carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted their place in the world, Maya had the careful posture of someone who was always prepared to make herself invisible. "What's your name?" Catherine asked softly. I mean, I heard Daddy say Maya, but I want to hear it from you. Maya Johnson, Maya replied. And she noticed Catherine's slight flinch at the different last name, the reminder that Maya had grown up as someone else's daughter in the eyes of the law. Maya, Catherine repeated, as if testing how the name felt in her mouth. I always wanted a sister. When I was little, I used to pretend I had one. I would set an extra place at my tea parties and talk to the empty chair. The innocent admission broke something open in Maya's chest. While she had been growing up wondering about the father she had never met, Catherine had been longing for a sister without knowing that sister actually existed. I wanted a family, Maya said simply. I wanted to know where I came from, why I looked different from my mother, why I felt like I was always missing something I couldn't name. The two girls looked at each other across the space between their different lives, and Maya could see recognition dawning in Catherine's eyes. Despite their different circumstances, they had both been shaped by the absence that David's choices had created. Catherine had grown up without a sister. Maya had grown up without a father. And both had felt the lack without understanding its source. Reverend Williams, who had been watching the scene unfold with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping families navigate their most difficult moments, finally stepped forward. Perhaps, he suggested gently, we could move this conversation to my office. Give everyone a chance to speak privately, away from the congregation. But, before anyone could respond, an older woman in the third pew stood up. Maya recognized her from the society pages as Margaret Blackwood, one of the city's most prominent social figures, and a longtime friend of the Hawthorne family. David, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Is this child telling the truth? Do you have another daughter? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Maya realized that this moment would define not just her relationship with her father, but David's place in the community he had worked so hard to join. The answer he gave would be repeated at dinner parties and charity events for years to come. David looked at Margaret, then at his wife, then at Catherine, and finally at Maya. She could see him weighing his options, calculating the cost of truth against the price of continued deception. For a moment that felt like a lifetime, Maya thought he might deny her, might claim she was confused or lying or seeking attention. But then David stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 17 years of suppressed truth. Yes, he said clearly, so that everyone in the church could hear. Maya is my daughter. I was with her mother before I married Eleanor. When Patricia told me she was pregnant, I was young and scared and selfish. I chose to walk away rather than face the responsibility. I have regretted that decision every day for the past 17 years. The admission sent a shock wave through the congregation. Maya heard gasps and whispers and the sound of someone crying. But all her attention was focused on her father, on the man who had finally acknowledged her existence not just to her, but to his entire world. Eleanor sank back into her pew as if her legs could no longer support her. The careful facade she had maintained for decades was crumbling in front of 200 witnesses, and Maya could see the panic in her eyes as she realized that their family's secrets were no longer secret. David, Eleanor whispered, but her voice carried in the silence. How could you do this to me? How could you humiliate me like this? Maya felt a flash of anger at the older woman's self-pity. Eleanor was worried about humiliation while Maya had spent 17 years wondering if she was worthy of love, wondering what flaw in her character had made her father walk away. This isn't about you, Maya said, and her voice was harder than she had intended. This isn't about your embarrassment or your social standing. This is about a girl who grew up without a father because he was too cowardly to stay. The harsh words hit David like physical blows, but Maya could see that he did not try to defend himself. He absorbed her anger as if he believed he deserved it, as if he had been waiting 17 years for someone to hold him accountable for the choice he had made as a young man. Catherine was crying again, but these tears seemed different from before. She was not crying for her ruined wedding or her shattered illusions about her perfect family. She was crying for the sister she had never known existed, for the years they had lost, for the father who had been present in her life, but absent from Maya's. I'm sorry, Catherine said, and Maya realized her half-sister was speaking to her. I'm sorry you grew up without him. I'm sorry I got to have what you should have had too. The generosity in Catherine's words took Maya by surprise. She had expected anger or resentment or denial from the daughter who had been chosen while Maya was abandoned. Instead, Catherine was offering sympathy and understanding, acknowledging the unfairness that had shaped both their lives. It's not your fault, Maya replied, and she meant it. You were just a baby when he made his choice. You didn't ask to be the only daughter he claimed. James had been standing at the altar through this entire exchange, watching his bride navigate the most difficult conversation of her life. Now he walked down the aisle to join Catherine, his face grave with understanding. Catherine, he said gently, what do you want to do? Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Catherine looked at her groom, then at her father, then at Maya. Maya could see her half-sister struggling with the weight of impossible choices. Catherine could choose to continue with her wedding, pretending that this revelation had never happened. She could ask Maya to leave and try to return to the life she had known before. Or she could choose to embrace the truth, even if it meant sacrificing the perfect wedding day she had planned for months. I want to know my sister, Catherine said finally. I want to know everything about her. I want to know what her life has been like, what our father missed by not being there. I want to understand how we can be family even though we've been strangers. Maya felt tears start to flow down her own cheeks then, tears of relief and gratitude, and something that might have been hope. She had come to the church expecting nothing more than a glimpse of her father's face. Instead, she had found a sister who was willing to claim her, who was willing to bridge the gap between their different worlds. But even as Maya felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest, she was aware that the hardest conversations were still ahead of them. David would have to explain why he had abandoned her and her mother. Eleanor would have to decide whether she could accept Maya as part of their family. The community would have to process the revelation that one of their most respected families had been built on a foundation of secrets. Maya looked around the church one more time. At the stage, Maya's choice came in the form of a single step forward. Not toward the exit, not away from the chaos she had created, but toward Catherine, toward the sister who was offering her a place in a family that had never included her before. I would like that, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would like to know you too. The simple words seemed to release something that had been held in suspension since Maya first stood up in the back pew. Catherine smiled through her tears, and for the first time since entering the church, Maya felt like she might actually belong somewhere. But the moment of connection between the sisters was interrupted by the sound of Eleanor Hawthorne's sharp intake of breath. David's wife had been sitting in stunned silence, but now she rose again, her face flushed with an anger that seemed to have been building for years. This is insane, Eleanor declared, her voice carrying a brittleness that suggested she was very close to breaking completely. We cannot simply welcome this girl into our family as if nothing has happened. There are legal implications, financial considerations, social consequences that none of you seem to be considering. Maya felt the coldness in Eleanor's words like a slap across her face. She had never asked for money or legal recognition or a place in the Hawthorne social circle. She had simply wanted to see her father's face, to understand where she had come from. But Eleanor was treating her like a threat to be managed rather than a person to be acknowledged. She's not asking for anything, Catherine said, her voice sharp with protective anger. She just wants to know her family. Her family. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and harsh. This girl's family consists of whatever woman raised her after David abandoned his responsibilities. We are not her family. We are the people whose lives she has chosen to disrupt for her own selfish purposes. The cruelty in Eleanor's words hit Maya harder than any physical blow could have. She had spent her entire life wondering if she was worthy of love, if there was something fundamentally wrong with her that had made her father walk away. Now Eleanor was confirming her worst fears, suggesting that Maya's very existence was an intrusion on other people's happiness. David finally found his voice again, and when he spoke, there was steel in his tone that Maya had not heard before. That's enough, Eleanor, he said firmly. Maya is my daughter. That makes her part of this family whether you like it or not. And she is not selfish for wanting to know her father. I'm the one who was selfish for walking away from her in the first place. The public rebuke of his wife sent whispers through the congregation again. Maya realized that she was witnessing the breakdown of a marriage that had probably been strained by secrets for years. Eleanor had built her life around maintaining appearances, and David's acknowledgement of Maya was destroying the carefully constructed image that Eleanor had worked so hard to create. "You're going to choose her over us?" Eleanor asked, and her voice was thick with hurt and disbelief. "After everything I've given you, everything we've built together, you're going to throw it all away for a stranger?" Maya wanted to tell Eleanor that she was not trying to steal David from his family, that she was not asking him to choose between his daughters. But before she could speak, David answered for himself. "I'm not choosing anyone over anyone," he said. "I'm trying to figure out how to be a father to both of my daughters. I failed Maya for 17 years. I won't fail her anymore." The declaration sent a shock of hope through Maya's chest. But she could also see the pain it caused Catherine and Eleanor. David was trying to right an old wrong, but his attempts at redemption were creating new pain for the family he had built in Maya's absence. James, who had been quietly observing the family drama unfolding around him, finally stepped forward. His wedding day had been completely destroyed, but Maya could see that he was more concerned about Catherine's emotional state than about the disrupted ceremony. "Maybe we should take Reverend Williams up on his offer," James suggested. "Move this conversation somewhere more private where everyone can speak freely without worrying about an audience." But Catherine shook her head, her green eyes bright with determination that reminded Maya powerfully of their shared father. "No," Catherine said. "I'm tired of secrets. I'm tired of private conversations that leave people out. Maya has been left out of our family for 17 years because of private conversations and decisions made without her. If we're going to be a family now, we're going to be honest with each other." Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward her half-sister, this girl who was willing to sacrifice her perfect wedding day for the sake of truth and connection. Catherine was choosing transparency over convenience, relationship over reputation. "Catherine's right," Maya said, finding her voice again. "I've spent my whole life wondering about secrets, trying to piece together the truth from fragments and hints. I don't want any more secrets." She turned to address the entire congregation then, these 200 witnesses who had seen her family's private pain played out in public. "I know this isn't what any of you came here to see today," Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You came to celebrate love and commitment and the joining of two families. Instead, you're seeing the consequences of choices made 17 years ago, the pain that secrets can cause when they're finally revealed." Maya paused, looking around the church at faces that ranged from sympathetic to shocked to disapproving. She realized that what she said next would determine how her story was remembered and told in the years to come. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Maya continued. "I don't want to destroy marriages or ruin weddings or cause pain to people who never asked to be part of this situation. I just wanted to know where I came from. I wanted to see my father's face and understand why I have his eyes. I wanted to know if I had other family members who might care about me." She looked directly at Catherine then, at the sister who had offered her acceptance in the midst of chaos. "I found more than I ever hoped for," Maya said. "I found a sister who is willing to know me despite the circumstances. I found a father who is finally ready to acknowledge me. That's worth more to me than any perfect wedding or any social reputation." Catherine was crying again, but she was also smiling, and Maya could see something like relief in her expression. Perhaps Catherine had also been carrying the weight of family secrets without understanding their source. Perhaps she had also felt that something was missing from her seemingly perfect life. "I want to get to know you too," Catherine said. "I want to know what your life has been like, what you love, what you dream about. I want to know what kind of person you are beyond this moment." Eleanor made a sound of disgust and started to move toward the church exit, but David caught her arm gently. "Eleanor, please," he said. "Don't walk away. We need to figure this out together." "Together?" Eleanor's voice was shrill with disbelief. "You want me to sit here and plan a relationship with the child you had with another woman? You want me to pretend that this is a normal family situation that we can just work through with good communication?" Maya could see the raw pain in Eleanor's face, the sense of betrayal that went beyond the revelation of Maya's existence. Eleanor had built her identity around being David's wife, the mother of his only child, the woman who had helped him become successful and respectable. Maya's presence threatened all of that, calling into question everything Eleanor thought she knew about her husband and her marriage. I understand why you're angry, Maya said carefully, addressing Eleanor directly for the first time. I understand that my existence changes things for your family. But I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I'm not asking for your husband or your home or your life. I'm just asking to be acknowledged as who I am. Eleanor turned to look at Maya fully for the first time, and Maya could see her taking in the details of her appearance. The carefully mended dress, the worn shoes, the way Maya carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to make do with less. What do you want? Eleanor asked bluntly. Money? Education? A place in our social circle? What is this really about? The question revealed more about Eleanor's worldview than Maya had expected. To Eleanor, everything was transactional. Every relationship was based on what people could give to or take from each other. She could not imagine that Maya might simply want connection and understanding. I want to know my father, Maya said simply. I want to understand where I came from. I want to be able to call Catherine my sister without feeling like I'm stealing something that doesn't belong to me. She paused, then added, I want my mother to not have to work double shifts anymore because she's the only one supporting us. But I don't want that to come from charity or guilt. I want it to come from responsibility and love. The mention of Patricia seemed to hit David like a physical blow. Maya could see him imagining her mother, probably in her uniform at the diner right now, unaware that their secret was no longer secret. Patricia had worked so hard to provide for Maya, had sacrificed her own dreams and opportunities to make sure her daughter had everything she needed. How is your mother? David asked quietly. Really, how is she? Maya considered the question, thinking about the woman who had raised her with such fierce independence and quiet strength. She's tired, Maya said honestly. She works 2 jobs and still worries about money. She never complains, but I can see it wearing on her. She's 43 years old, and she looks older because she's carried everything alone for so long. David's face crumpled with guilt and regret. Maya realized that he had probably spent years convincing himself that Patricia was fine, that she had moved on, and found someone else to help her raise Maya. Learning that Patricia was still struggling, still alone, made his abandonment seem even more cruel. I should have helped, David said. I should have sent money, should have checked on you both, should have done something other than pretend you didn't exist. Yes, Maya said simply. You should have. The blunt acknowledgement seemed to hit David harder than any anger or accusation could have. Maya was not yelling or crying or demanding explanations. She was simply stating the truth that they both knew, the fact that he had failed in the most basic responsibility of fatherhood. Catherine moved closer to Maya, and Maya could feel her sister's presence as a source of strength and support. Despite the chaos and confusion of the day, Catherine was choosing to stand with her, to claim their relationship even though it complicated everything about her previously perfect life. What happens now? Catherine asked. How do we move forward from here? David Hawthorne looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in her life. Not the quick glance of recognition when he had first turned around, not the shocked stare of a man confronting his past, but the careful study of a father trying to see who his child had become without him. Maya stood perfectly still under his scrutiny, letting him take in the details that spoke of a life he had never witnessed. The way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her worn clothes, the intelligence in her eyes that reminded him painfully of her mother, the stubborn set of her chin that was purely his own. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with privilege or expensive clothes, beautiful in the way that came from strength and character and the kind of resilience that only grew from facing hardship alone. I want to try, David said finally, and his voice was thick with emotion. I want to be your father, if you'll let me. I know I don't deserve a second chance, and I know I can't make up for 17 years of absence. But I want to try to be the father you should have had all along. Maya felt something break open in her chest, something that had been held tightly closed since she was old enough to understand that other children had fathers who came home for dinner and helped with homework and attended school plays. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of possibility. I want that too, Maya said softly. I want to know you. I want to understand who you are beyond the picture my mother saved, beyond the stories I made up in my head about why you left. Eleanor had been watching this exchange with growing distress, and now she stepped forward again, her face pale with anger and desperation. David, you can't seriously be considering this, she said, her voice shaking. Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation, to our standing in this community? Do you understand what people will say about our family? Maya felt the familiar sting of being treated as a source of shame rather than a person with feelings and worth. But before she could respond, Catherine spoke up with a firmness that surprised everyone in the church. Let them talk, Catherine said, looking directly at her stepmother. Let them gossip and judge and whisper behind their hands. I would rather have an honest family with secrets revealed than a perfect facade built on lies. The statement was a revelation of Catherine's character, showing a strength that went deeper than her privileged upbringing might have suggested. Maya realized that her sister was choosing truth over comfort, relationship over reputation, and the courage of that choice filled Maya with admiration and gratitude. Eleanor, David said gently but firmly, Maya is my daughter. That makes her part of our family whether it's convenient or not. I understand that this is difficult for you, and I understand that my past choices have created a situation that affects your life too. But I won't abandon her again. I can't live with that guilt anymore. Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions, from anger to hurt to something that looked like resignation. Maya realized that Eleanor had probably known this moment would come eventually, had probably lived with the fear that David's past would someday catch up with their carefully constructed present. What about Catherine's wedding? Eleanor asked, her voice smaller now, less combative. What about our guests, our friends, the life we've built here? Maya looked around the church at the 200 witnesses who had seen her family's private drama played out in the most public way possible. She thought about the society pages and the gossip that would follow this revelation, about the way people would analyze and judge every aspect of what had happened. We could finish the ceremony, Maya said quietly. I could leave, and you could continue with Catherine's wedding. People would talk for a while, but eventually it would become old news. You could go back to your normal life and pretend this never happened. But even as Maya offered the escape that Eleanor clearly wanted, she knew it was not what she herself wanted. She had spent too many years being invisible, being the secret that was never spoken, being the daughter who did not count. She was tired of making herself smaller to make other people comfortable. Catherine must have sensed Maya's thoughts, because she reached out and took her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. I don't want to finish the ceremony, Catherine said, her voice clear and strong. Not like this. Not with secrets between us and lies that we're all pretending to believe. She looked at James, who had been standing quietly beside her through this entire emotional storm. James, I'm sorry, Catherine said. This isn't the wedding day you signed up for. If you want to postpone, if you need time to think about whether you want to marry into a family that's this complicated, I'll understand. James had been silent for so long that Maya had almost forgotten he was there. But now he stepped forward and took Catherine's other hand, his face serious but kind. Catherine, he said gently, I fell in love with you because you're honest and brave and compassionate. What you're doing right now, the way you're choosing your sister over social expectations, just makes me love you more. If you want to postpone the wedding so you can get to know Maya, we'll postpone. If you want to continue and include Maya in our celebration, we'll do that. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Maya felt tears start to flow down her cheeks again, tears of gratitude for this man who barely knew her but was willing to accept her as part of his new family. James was showing the kind of generous spirit that Maya had always hoped existed but had rarely encountered in her own life. What do you think? Catherine asked, turning to Maya. Would you stay for my wedding? Would you help me figure out how to be sisters? The invitation was everything Maya had never dared to dream of: acceptance, inclusion, the chance to be part of a family celebration instead of watching from the outside. But it was also terrifying in its implications. Staying would mean stepping fully into a life that was not her own, accepting kindness from people who owed her nothing, believing that she deserved love and attention and care. Maya thought about her mother, who was probably taking lunch orders at the diner and had no idea that their carefully guarded secret was no longer secret. Patricia had spent 17 years protecting Maya from exactly this kind of situation, understanding that hope could be more dangerous than hopelessness when it was built on unstable foundations. But Maya also thought about the photograph in her hand, the image of David that had led her to this moment. She had carried it like a talisman for 3 years, and now she was looking at the real man whose face had given her her own features. He was older and grayer and more tired than the young man in the picture, but he was also real in a way that her fantasies had never been. "I'll stay," Maya said finally, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. "I'll stay if you really want me to. But I need to call my mother first. She needs to hear about this from me, not from someone else." David's face went white at the mention of Patricia, and Maya could see him realizing that the consequences of this day extended far beyond the church walls. Patricia would have to deal with questions and attention and the reopening of wounds that she had spent 17 years trying to heal. "Would she want to come?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Your mother, I mean. Would she want to be here for this?" The question caught Maya off guard. In all her fantasies about meeting her father, she had never imagined that Patricia might be included, that the woman who had raised her alone might be welcomed into the family that had excluded her for so long. "I don't know," Maya said honestly. "She's worked very hard to put the past behind her. This might be more painful for her than healing." But even as Maya expressed doubt, she felt a sudden fierce desire to have her mother there, to have Patricia witness Maya's acceptance into the family that had rejected them both. Patricia deserved to see that her daughter was worth claiming, worth celebrating, worth including in moments of joy. "I'd like to meet her," David said quietly. "I'd like to apologize to her, to try to explain why I made the choices I did. I know she probably doesn't want to see me, but I owe her that conversation." Maya looked at her father, at this man who was finally ready to face the consequences of his past choices. She thought about the conversation that would happen when Patricia learned that their secret was no longer secret, about the pain and awkwardness and possibility that such a conversation might contain. "I'll call her," Maya said. "I'll explain what happened and ask if she wants to come. But you have to understand that she might say no. She might not be ready for this." David nodded, his face grave with understanding. Maya realized that he was beginning to comprehend the full scope of what his abandonment had cost, not just in terms of his relationship with Maya, but in terms of the life that Patricia had been forced to build alone. Eleanor had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, and now she sank into the front pew as if her legs could no longer support her. "This is really happening," Eleanor said, and her voice was hollow with disbelief. "We're really going to turn our lives upside down for a stranger." Maya felt the sting of being called a stranger again, but Catherine's response was swift and fierce. "She's not a stranger," Catherine said firmly. "She's my sister. She's Daddy's daughter. That makes her family, and family is worth any inconvenience or embarrassment or social complication." The declaration seemed to settle something for everyone in the church. Maya realized that Catherine's acceptance had created a new reality, one in which Maya was no longer an intruder or a disruption, but a member of the family who deserved to be there. Reverend Williams, who had been watching this family drama unfold with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate their most difficult moments, finally stepped forward again. "If you're going to continue with the ceremony," he said gently, "we should probably let our guests." It was the question that everyone in the church was thinking but had been afraid to ask. Maya looked around at the faces watching her, David with his guilt and regret, Eleanor with her anger and fear, Catherine with her hope and determination, James with his quiet support for his bride. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "I never thought past this moment. I never imagined that seeing my father would lead to meeting my sister, to having these conversations, to changing everyone's life." She looked at David again, at the man whose absence had shaped her entire existence. "I guess that depends on what you want," she said to him. "Do you want to be my father now? Do you want to try to build a relationship even though we're strangers? Or are you going to walk away again?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of 17 years of absence and the possibility of connection that Maya had never dared to hope for. David's answer would determine not just Maya's future, but the future of everyone in the church who had been touched by this revelation. Maya waited for his response, finally, ready to hear the truth about whether she was worth staying for. Windows, and the scattered flowers, and the congregation of witnesses who had seen her claim her birthright. She thought about her mother, who was probably serving lunch at the diner and had no idea that their carefully guarded secret was no longer secret. She thought about the life she had known until this morning, the quiet existence of a girl who worked hard and kept her head down and never asked for more than she thought she deserved. That life was over now, changed forever by the decision to walk into a church and speak the truth that had lived in her heart for 17 years. Maya had wanted to see her father's face, and she had accomplished that goal beyond her wildest imagination. Now she had to figure out how to live with the consequences of getting everything she had wished for. The church was still silent, still waiting to see what would happen next. Maya realized that she was standing at a crossroads, that the next words she spoke would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone whose life she had just disrupted. She looked at Catherine, at this sister who was offering her acceptance and love despite the circumstances of their meeting. She looked at David, at the father who had finally admitted she existed but who still carried the guilt of 17 years of absence. Maya took a deep breath and made her choice. The moment stretched between them like a bridge that could either carry them toward each other or collapse under the weight of all the years that had passed in silence. Maya had come to the church to see her father's face, and she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. Now she had to decide what to do with the truth she had uncovered, and how to live in a world where secrets had become stories that everyone would tell. Ice was trapped somewhere between her heart and her throat, lost in the space between who she was and who she wanted to be. Instead, she simply stood there, a 17-year-old girl in a thrift store dress, holding a photograph and carrying a truth that was about to change everything for everyone in that church. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable in its weight. Maya could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the stares of 200 strangers pressing against her skin like physical touch. She had wanted to see her father's face, and she had succeeded beyond her wildest imagination. Now she just had to figure out what came next.